Welcome CSC 200 to EX8. We're going to call this form validation. This will be a little kind of extra part of our EX7B that we just finished. I'm opening up my index.html from our 7B folder, and here's my index. And if I go down here, you'll see that we have these are HTML comments in here that are commenting out where we're going to put our JavaScript. We're going to use JavaScript. Now we could use PHP as well, but we're going to use JavaScript for our form validation. That means when we complete our form, or when we start to enter information in our form, we don't want to put in blank information. So it's going to kind of validate things before it actually submits the form to enter information into our database. So the first thing I'm going to do here, other than opening up index and displayb.php, and again, just to review, our displayb PHP is actually the page that's going to display after we complete our form and after we enter new items into the database. They're going to show up on our displayb PHP file. That's what's going to display from the server. And our index page is where we initially have a form. Now, we're going to look at a couple of these things here, but the first thing you want to do is probably just connect to your phpMyAdmin. So you could do that by doing phpMyAdmin like you usually do, and it's control and then space install. And then when it does that, you can click on the link and just say open. Now that'll be your phpMyAdmin, and your username, if you're not sure of your username, it'll say it right down here. There it is, there's mine. So I'll go in here and I'll hit go. And this is my EX6 SpongeBob database. I'll just click on characters so that I can browse and see my characters. You can see the last thing I have here is Barbara Bass, and I was just kind of throwing things in here. They started with ID 101 and auto incremented to 114, and some of these I was just kind of trying out here when I was working with my form. But I'm going to go back to my form now, and I'm going to run project. I'll make sure everything's kind of open here. And if your project isn't showing up, actually mine's not showing up here, just click on preview and just say preview running application. And then if this comes up down here, I'm just going to open it up in a new window. I'm not sure why it wasn't opening up in its own, but if you have that issue, and then I'll close this down here. I don't need this open down here. I want it open up in a separate one. So this is where you'd normally go to open that up. And this is where we put our form information in here. And what we want well, actually, if I just hit submit right now, it shows my database. And now what happens is I have a blank item here because it let me actually just click without putting anything in. So I have a blank item here, and I could fix that in my phpMyAdmin. So I'll fix that. But what we want to do is we want to validate this before doing that so that it doesn't do anything until we actually put information in all the fields. So what we're going to have to do, we'll use JavaScript for this. And like I said, you could use PHP, but we'll use JavaScript. So I'm just going to minimize this or put this down right now. And everything we do is going to be in here. Now, some of the code that we have in our HTML we'll be able to use. We actually had a name that we can use in certain ways. And we also have an ID. I like to use the ID, so I'm going to use that one. And if you go to W3 Schools, they have a JavaScript tutorial. And they have a thing called, if you go to the DOM elements, if you look for DOM down here, if you scroll down here and you see a thing that says JS HTML DOM, and if you click on DOM elements, it shows you the way to find HTML elements. The DOM is the document object model. You could find elements in your web page by their ID, by their tag name, class name, CSS selectors, HTML object collections. I'm more familiar with using ID and class name and tag name. And I find, and it's also the easiest, and it works with older versions of browser. So I like using ID. It even says the easiest way to find an HTML element is by using an element ID. Now, you have to give it an ID first, which we did. These form fields for first name, last name, species, and gender all have IDs. First, last, species, and gender. Those are the ID names. So we could use those. And this is kind of how it works. We're going to create a variable that's going to represent getting that object. Now, one other thing I just want to point out here, and I'll go back to this a second. They have a thing for JS forms, and they have a validate form sample that you can kind of use, and we could use part of this because it does show actually how it works. But I'm not going to use this HTML object collection method. I'm going to use the get element by ID. But one thing to point out, you do need the dot value after the ID, because you want to get the value that someone puts into that form. So just remember that. We'll get back to this in a little bit, but I do want to make sure that I use that dot value. So if I go back here to this get element by ID, I'm just going to highlight this. I could copy this right out of here, and I'll go into where my JavaScript's going to be. Now, just because I have HTML tags here that say start JavaScript, that doesn't mean it's going to be JavaScript. What actually starts JavaScript is going to be script tags, and it's just script. So that's really where your JavaScript's going to be, and I'm just going to paste that in there. And I'm not going to call it var element. I'll just call it, actually our variables names can be the same as the ID name, so you could do this. You could say first. Nothing wrong with doing that. And we're getting it from the ID first. So we're doing the variable first equals, and we're making a variable so we can use that with JavaScript. But first we have to get the value from the ID, which is named first, which is here, and then we have to put dot value at the end. So that's what we're going to do first. We have these variables, and once you do this, we could create 4 of these because we're going to get 4 fields. And then I'll change this one to be last, this one to be species, and this one to be gender. And then also these things have to change. So if you're using the same name, you could just copy and paste. So 2 separate things here. The ID name is how it was identified in your HTML text. The variable name is what JavaScript is going to use. So we're getting the values. We have variables that represent them. So that's not actually anything that's going to happen yet. Now we just have names, just like we said variables in PHP. What we're going to do is actually kind of run a function now that's going to make sure that people add something in here. They're going to make sure that these fields aren't blank. And if you go back now, I was in DOM elements, and I'm actually going to go to JS forms. If you scroll down and find JS forms, and actually have it open here. And at the very top, they have JavaScript form validation. So they actually have it almost done for you, and they have an example here. And if you click on try it yourself, they have code here, and they have a little example of what happens. And if you hit submit, they have an alert. Now you can have an alert pop up, or you could have something right to the page. I'll show you both ways to do that. You could do either one. The alert's pretty easy, and they have it right here, so we'll do that first. But then if you want to try something else, we could do that. And basically, it won't let you submit the form. Now I could put, I'll throw my name in here, and now I could submit it, and you can see now it gets submitted. So that's what this function's doing. They have a function here called validate form, and I'm just going to copy it and use it. Why not? A lot of it's done for us, but we're going to change it a little bit. So I'll go here, and I'll put it right after here, and I'll make sure I move. Now our variables could be inside the function, but they don't have to be. Now tabs, like if you're using Python or something, are very important. For this, it's not as much. What's important in JavaScript is actually worrying about your curly brackets. So I'm going to move my curly brackets over, because basically I have curly brackets for my function. Starting here is function keyword. The name of the function is called validate form. And then there's an opening curly bracket and a closing curly bracket. And maybe I'll move this one over. And I'll move this over. It might be easier to see. And now I have an if statement. And I'm just going to tab these over so they're easier to see. Then I have an if statement. That's it. Now here they have the variables right in here. Now we don't even have to use this. What you could do is just wipe that out and copy these or cut them and put them right in here. You could put those right there, and then we'll put everything right in the function. And I'll just tab over so everything kind of looks nice. But the tabs aren't as important as Python if you've messed around with Python at all. So now we have our variables, and our first one here, it says x equals nothing. Now we're not using x. Our first one would be first. So we would actually use a variable called first. We're basically saying if first up here, if no one puts anything there for first, then you could say an alert, and let's just say first name must be filled out. And then they have something called return false, meaning when it returns false, when we actually run the function, it's going to have a false that's going to be returned with it, meaning it won't actually run the onSubmit. And I'll explain that in a little bit, but let's do this first. So now these are if-else statements, and what you can do here is copy one of these. And remember, this is the closing, and I'll just put closing, opening and closing curly braces for the if statement. But what I'm going to do now is we're going to basically copy and paste this 4 times. And I'll move it out so it looks nice. And I'll just change this to be last right away before I do anything else. And I could change the other ones later, but let me do this first. And I'll paste it again. And this one is going to be species. And then I'll have one more. And this one is going to be called gender. So if you don't fill anything out for gender. So we have those correct. Now, obviously, we have to change these. So I'll say last name here. I'll say species. Now, this is just the alert message that's getting printed out. And I'll put gender. Now all these have return false. Now these are all if statements, and what we can do in JavaScript is put else if. And once I do that, I'll copy this. For all the other ones after the if, I'll put else if and put a space. So it's else if and a space in between. And then the very last one, what we'll do, I'll do one more and I'll just say else. Else is just kind of the final kind of condition, and there's no real condition there. You don't put a condition, but notice that I'm putting 2 curly brackets for else, and what's going to happen here, I'll copy return false. I'm going to put return true. And basically that means it'll send it, when it runs through the function, it'll have a return true, meaning it'll run the submit. So it'll skip over all this stuff and just say return true, run the function. So I'm going to put that there. So that's basically, so the function, or basically the on submit from our form will not really work, or not really get put through. Information won't be put through until it gets a return true. And I'll show you what happens with that. But so far everything's okay here in what we want. We may actually want to reset our form to have everything blank, but right now everything is what we want. We have an if, an else if, else if, else if, and then finally an else. If we had more forms, you could have all else ifs in the middle. Usually it ends with else and it starts with if. By putting quote, quote right next to each other, double quote, that means it's an empty string. That means you didn't put anything in there. If you had that, that would be a space. But make sure they're right next to each other. So this is okay, and make sure all the names match up. Those are our ID names. These are these. And that looks okay so far. Now the last part of this is we're just going to put the function in here. It's in here already. I'll just start it over. I had a different one in here that I was practicing with, but what we're going to put in here after the equal signs, just like these have attributes in here. Form action equals something in quotes, method equals post in quotes. We're going to put on submit equals, and in quotes, we're going to put the function validate form, and then we also inside the quote have to put return. And if you're not sure, take a look at this thing, and they actually have the same thing in here. If you look at the sample here, they have return validate form, and it's in quotes. And the function has the function name, and it has the opening and closing parentheses. And it has the opening and closing parentheses. So if you've kind of followed this a little bit, like I said, we did this a little bit different. We used the get element by ID, but it's really doing the same thing. It's saying if x is equal to nothing, and notice that the conditions have to be in parentheses, whereas like in Python or something, they don't always have to be. And then there's an alert statement where it basically just says alert, and then there's a string in there. The string is just kind of the quotes. It's just a statement in quotes that's going to print out. And notice everything has semicolons at the end to also terminate. So going back to here, to what I have, I just want to check that I have semicolons after everything, and I do, because I copied what they have. And even down here, return true as semicolons. So everything's kind of set up. And I also want to make sure up here that it has return, comma, valid, or not comma, but a space. And it says return, space, validate form, and that's all in quotes. And that's what's going to happen here. So I'm going to save this. My PHP file should be okay, because I didn't really change that. Okay, this will be a good place to take a break. So let me take a break right here. We'll end part 1 here, and then we'll pick off where we left off for part 2.